Afghanistan leaders and international diplomats have met in Geneva to evaluate strategies and aid offered to the country in an attempt to resolve the country's political impasse.
The two-day conference on Afghanistan, jointly hosted by the Afghan government and the United Nations, comes at a time when U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is actively seeking a peace deal with the Taliban.
While no fresh financial commitments are expected, the conference will be a chance for donors to measure results against the $15.2 billion committed for Afghanistan at the last funding meeting in Brussels in 2016. With Afghan security forces struggling to hold back increasingly confident Taliban fighters and Western appetite for further commitments uncertain, the conference comes at a very sensitive moment.
The government will present a growth strategy mapping out how an economy battered by 40 years of war can one day stand on its own, as well as pledges on issues ranging from fighting corruption to women's empowerment. We are now joined via Skype by Iranian Tehran University professor and independent political analyst on countries like Afghanistan, Professor Seyed Marandi. Prof, thank you so much for joining us and a very good evening. Now, Afghanistan leaders are briefing international diplomats meeting in Geneva who want to evaluate whether strategies and aid offered to Afghanistan are helping resolve the political stalemate created by many years of war. Are aid and international efforts working to resolve the problem?
No, unfortunately, the situation in Afghanistan is getting progressively worse. In fact, the situation today is much worse than it was when the U.S. first occupied the country. The production of heroin and poppies in Afghanistan has increased 30-fold under U.S. occupation, and many people in Afghanistan believe that the U.S. military is deeply involved in the drugs trade. On the other hand, the economic situation has deteriorated, and the Taliban has made significant advances on many fronts in the country. And in addition to that, over the last couple of years, since the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, many elements that are linked to ISIS have been moved to Afghanistan. And the Iranian intelligence actually believes that the United States has been involved in facilitating the movement of ISIS from Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan.
Now, Prof, with the ongoing war effectively in a stalemate, both the US and Russia have held separate talks with the Taliban. Now, this is an effort to start a peace process. Why the separate talks?
Well, the interests of the United States and the Russians are very different. The Russians have a direct interest in the stability of Afghanistan because it is close to Central Asia, which is key to the Russians. On the other hand, the United States has an interest because if the United States is able to maintain its presence in Afghanistan, it has access to India, to Pakistan, to Iran, to Central Asia, and Russia and China. So it can cause the United States, through facilitating extremism, it can cause trouble in Central Asia, it can cause trouble for China, for Russia, for Iran, and it gives the United States a great deal of influence across the board. And remember, the United States has a very long history of supporting extremists. From in the late 1970s, the United States supported the extremists in Afghanistan. Brzezinski, who was the U.S. National Security Advisor under Carter, actually admitted that they supported these extremists in order to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan, thus leading to the destruction of the country. So the Americans and the Saudis, for many decades, they've been supporting extremists, as we see now in Syria as well, and in Yemen, where Al-Qaeda is fighting alongside the Saudis against the people of Yemen. So Afghanistan is very important for the United States, and the United States can cause a lot of trouble. And as I said earlier, the long-term occupation of the country by the United States has only made the situation worse, and people believe that there is a reason for that.
Now, you spoke about the resurgence of terror groups in numbers not seen in a very long time in Afghanistan. Why now? And who stands to benefit from terror groups like ISIS?
Well, ISIS was always a fragmented group. It wasn't a single group with a united command in Syria and Iraq. They were spread out across these two countries, and different areas of these two countries were occupied by different parts of this organization, and it was a sort of loose umbrella organization. So just as we all know, even the BBC admitted this, when the United States was trying to take Raqqa and they utterly destroyed the city, they allowed ultimately in a deal large numbers of foreign fighters of ISIS to leave Raqqa so that they could go to Deir ez-Zor, another part of Syria, and fight the Syrian army. This is something that even Western media outlets have admitted. So ISIS, some of them, which are part of this broad, loose organization, they have shifted to Afghanistan, and the Taliban now, which the United States before was saying they would not accept under any circumstances, the Americans are now secretly negotiating with them without full coordination with the Afghanistani government. And the Afghanistani government is very upset that they are not fully informed, that the Pakistani intelligence, ISI, is also supporting these extremist groups, and that these Wahhabi, Saudi-funded Wahhabi madrasas are still being funded alongside the Pakistani-Afghani border. So the situation today has not improved whatsoever, but it has, sort of given the Americans an excuse to maintain their presence in the country. The reason why we have this fighting is the American occupation.
Now, Prof, there are reports that ISIS, commonly referred to as Daesh, is killing both Shiites and Sunnis in Afghanistan. In your opinion, what does this reveal about the nature of the terrorist group?
Well, ISIS in the beginning was a part of Al-Qaeda, and it was funded by the Saudis in Iraq to fight against the Iraqi government. Then it spread to Syria. ISIS created what we called, it was initially the Islamic State of Iraq. Then it created the Nusra Front in Syria. These two organizations fell out ultimately, and then ISI split away from Al-Qaeda and became ISIS. So the roots of all these organizations are the same. They are Wahhabi groups that have been funded by Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Persian Gulf region, and they've been used as tools in order to weaken governments that the United States and their regional allies consider to be antagonistic. Anyone who has any doubt about this should take a look at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012. This is the largest defense intelligence agency organization in the world. It's a part of the Pentagon with 20,000 people working for it. They admitted that from early on in Syria, these extremists had the upper hand among the opposition, and that U.S. allies in the region were supporting them. And later on, the head of this organization, General Michael Flynn, admitted that the United States took a willful decision to support its regional allies in supporting these.
We seem to have lost Professor Seyed. They was just giving us an update on the situation in Afghanistan and just going through issues and the meeting taking place in Geneva and the different secret meetings that are taking place from the US and Tehran. Prof. Seyed, are you back on with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. You were just giving us an update. I've got another question for you. Afghan's election organizers have vowed to hold elections on the April's presidential poll on time. Do you think, would this be agreeable? Do you think these will be free and fair?
No, unfortunately, I don't think they will be free and fair, because the United States in the recent parliamentary elections, the United States and those groups aligned to the United States have prevented the polls from being carried out in a free and fair way. In certain areas where the United States felt and its allies felt that groups not closely associated with the United States or critical of the United States have the upper hand, they, under the guise of a lack of security, prevented elections from being held in those areas. So just as in the recent parliamentary elections, we saw major shortcomings, I think that the Americans will try to manipulate the elections, the presidential elections, to get a result that they want.
Do you think that peace is possible in Afghanistan? Also considering that you have the latest death of a U.S. serviceman as announced by NATO, does this mean that Afghan military is far from being prepared to take over from foreign forces in the country?
Well, I think the problem really is the United States. The U.S. occupation is a major reason for people to rise up and fight, whether it's the Taliban or anyone else. The United States, by its presence and by its occupation of the country, and by humiliating the people, and by manipulating politics, and by using Afghani resources for themselves, they are creating this environment. So if the United States were to pull out, and if they were to force the Saudis to stop supporting extremists, and if they discontinued their own support for these extremists, without a doubt, within a reasonable period of time, the situation in Afghanistan would move towards some sort of stability. It is in the interest of all Afghanistan's neighbors to have a stable country. But as I said, the only thing that legitimizes, within scare quotes, of course, the only thing that so-called legitimizes the U.S. presence is violence in Afghanistan.
Prof, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is Iranian Tehran University professor and independent political analyst on countries like Afghanistan, Professor Seyed Marandi.